Dan Crow opened his eyes, and the first thing felt was a smell. The smell of smoke. Sweat. Something sour and sweet at the same time. That's it. A place where people die. He knew that smell. Southern Sudan. Field camp on the border. Tent made of tarpaulin floor and fly screens on the ceiling. Just under his back was not canvas fabric, but trampled soil, cold and damp. He tried to sit up, and his head exploded with pain. A dull, crushing pain, so intense that his vision went dark for a second. He waited it out, sat up, looked around. The room was dark and low-ceilinged, log walls, a ceiling of blackened planks. Light streamed in through a narrow window without glass, just a hole in the wall covered with something murky. A bladder. A bull's bladder. His brain registered this automatically and pushed it aside. People lay on the floor next to him. 5. No, 7. Someone was moaning. Someone was silent. Someone was too quiet. Dan looked at his hands. His hands. The same ones. Long fingers. A callus on his middle finger from holding a pen. A scar on his left palm from a can in Juba. He was himself. He felt his pulse at his wrist. 82. Steady. Good blood flow. Alive. The last thing he remembered was the night shift. A break. He'd stepped out onto the porch to smoke. Headlights. The screech of tires. A crash. And that was it. And now this. He thought maybe he'd had a stroke and was lying in the ICU, and everything around him was a hallucination of a dying brain. But hallucinations don't smell. But this had a smell, a very strong smell. He decided he'd figure it out later, because 2 meters away from him lay a child, and the child was fading away. Dan crawled toward him on all fours. A boy, about 5, maybe 6. His skin was gray. His lips were dry and cracked until they bled. His eyes were sunken. Dan took the child's thin hand and pinched the skin on the back of his palm. The fold remained. It didn't spring back. 0 turgor. He pulled back the lower eyelid. Pale mucous membrane, almost white. He checked the pulse. 140. Thready. The child was dying of dehydration. A classic case, 3rd degree. Another hour or 2, and that's it. A woman was sitting next to the boy. She looked at Dan with huge, unblinking eyes. That's how people look when they've already understood everything and are just waiting. Dan had seen that look dozens of times. In Sudan, during night shifts when parents brought their children in too late. He hated that look. He turned to the woman and said he needed water. Clean, boiled, with a pinch of salt and a spoonful of honey. Right now. The woman didn't move. He repeated himself, slower, louder. She didn't understand half the words, but something in his voice got through to her. Not a shout, not a plea. The calm, matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times and knew exactly what to do next. She stood up and ran off. Dan turned to the boy. He lifted his head and laid it on his bent leg. Then he waited. While he waited, he looked over the others. The woman by the wall was pressing a hand wrapped in rags to her chest. Fluid was seeping from under the rags. The smell was unmistakable, sweetish, nauseating. Gangrene. Not in its early stages. Dan looked away. One thing at a time, the boy first. The woman returned with a clay bowl. The water was warm and slightly cloudy. He asked if they'd boiled it. The woman nodded uncertainly. He sniffed the water, held it up to the light, decided it would do. There wasn't anything else anyway. The salt was coarse, gray, as large as fine gravel. The honey was dark and thick. He stirred the mixture with his finger. He tasted it. Salty, slightly sweet. Not perfect, but close. ORS. Oral rehydration salts. The simplest medicine in the world. Water, salt, sugar, or honey. Costs less than a kopeck. Saves millions of lives. He began to give the boy the solution, 1 teaspoon at a time, Every 2 minutes. Not any faster. You can't go any faster. His stomach won't handle it. He'll throw it up, and it'll only make things worse. There was no spoon. He used a scoop made from half a walnut shell that he found on the floor. He rinsed it with the remaining boiling water. The first dose. The boy swallowed reflexively. The second. The third. On the fourth, he coughed. Dan waited. He gave him some more. The woman sat nearby and watched. She wasn't crying. Her tears had long since dried up. Dan kept giving the boy the liquid for 40 minutes, then an hour, then 2. As the second hour drew to a close, the boy opened his eyes. Cloudy, wandering, but he opened them. He looked at his mother, and his lips twitched. He was trying to say something. His mother pulled him close, and then she began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears simply streamed down her dirty cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Dan straightened up. His knees ached, his back ached, his head ached. He was alive. The boy was alive. Good. Now he could think about where he was and what was happening. He stood up and walked toward the exit. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. He stepped outside and stopped. Before him lay a village, a dirty road, crooked houses made of logs and clay, skinny chickens, skinny children, scrawny adults. The sky was low and gray. Plumes of smoke rose in the distance. Not from a stove. Something big was burning. He looked closer. A house was burning. People stood near the burning house and watched in silence. No one was putting out the fire. A corpse lay on the side of the road, covered with a mat. A bare foot stuck out from under the mat. A child's foot. Dan stood there for a moment. He looked up at the sky, at the village, at the dead child on the roadside. He inhaled slowly and exhaled slowly. Then he said aloud, quietly and calmly, "All right." He looked around once more. No electricity, no wires, no antennas, not a single sign of technology older than the early Middle Ages. He didn't know where he was, didn't know how he'd gotten there, didn't know if he could get back. But he knew one thing. In this place, people die from things they shouldn't die from, and he knows how to stop it. He turned and walked back. He had a job to do. The first 3 days, Dan didn't sleep. To be more precise, he slept in fits and starts for 20 minutes leaning against the wall of very barn against which I woke up. The barn turned out to be something sort of a local infirmary. People brought those who could not keep at home, those who groaned too loudly, those from whose smelled too bad, the ones they were afraid of. Dan quickly figured out how things worked. The village was called Quiet Valley. The name sounded like a mockery because the only thing quiet here was the cemetery. They buried 6 to 8 people a week. The population had once been around 300. Now there were just over 200 left. By the end of his first day, Dan had identified the disease the locals called red fever. Typhus. Classic typhus with a rash. High fever, a rash on the abdomen and sides, delirium, dehydration. Death on the 8th to 10th day without treatment. This is what treatment looked like in Tiki Dole. A local healer, an old woman named Gorna. She recited prayers over the sick. She burned bundles of dried herbs. She tied a small bag of dried toad legs to the patient's chest. She gave them a decoction that Dan had sniffed once and never wanted to try again. Gorna wasn't mean or stupid. She simply didn't know any better. No one here knew. Dan didn't argue with her. He asked her to show him the well. Then he asked her to show him the outhouses. Then he stood silently by the stream from which the village drew its drinking water and where, further upstream, the runoff from the barn flowed into it. He closed his eyes. He opened them. The stream hadn't gone anywhere. He started with the water. He explained it to the village headman, a burly man with a red face and a hoarse voice. He explained that the water had to be boiled, all of it, always, without exception. The headman looked at him as if he were crazy. Dan repeated himself. The headman said they didn't have enough firewood as it was. Dan said that the dead don't need firewood, but the living need clean water. The village head fell silent, not because he understood, because the boy Dan had treated on his first day was his cousin's son. The boy was alive. That was a stronger argument than any explanation. Dan drew up a schedule. Morning, rounds, examining every patient, taking their temperature. He took their temperature by placing the back of his hand against their forehead. He didn't have a thermometer. He didn't have anything. His hands, his eyes, his nose, his ears. 4 tools. That was enough. He determined the severity of their condition by the color of their skin, by the smell of their breath, by the pulse rate, by the way a person was lying. A person who curls up on their side and pulls their knees to their stomach feels worse than one who lies on their back with their arms outstretched. That knowledge had cost him 6 years of medical training and 2 years in Africa. Here, it cost human lives. On the 3rd day, they brought in the blacksmith. His name was Garin, a burly man with arms like logs and a face as gray as ash. His left arm was severed from the elbow to the wrist. The axe had slipped off the log. The wound was open, deep. Bone shone white through the dark blood. The blood pulsed out in spurts, arterial bleeding. Dan looked at the wound, and time inside him shifted. As always, the world became sharp and slow. The sounds faded away. Only his hands and the wound remained. Gorna was already there. She'd managed to apply a spiderweb to the wound and cow manure for strength. Dan silently removed the spiderweb and the manure. Gorna started saying something. He didn't hear her. He shouted for boiling water, a clean cloth, moonshine. The moonshine here was distilled from grain, and it was strong and cloudy. Dan splashed it onto the wound. Garin howled so loudly that the walls shook. 2 men held him by the shoulders. Dan found the artery. He pinched it shut with his finger. Just his finger, the index finger of his right hand. He held it and didn't let go. With his left hand, he applied a tourniquet made from a belt above the wound. He tightened it. The blood stopped pulsing. It flowed slowly. Then it almost stopped. Now to stitch it up. He didn't have a needle. He asked for the thinnest sewing needle they could find in the village. They brought one, coarse, crooked, rusty. He boiled it for 10 minutes. Thread. The thread wasn't any good. He asked for horsehair. Long, strong. He boiled that too. 10 minutes. Gorna stood in the corner, crossing herself. Dan began to sew, layer by layer. Deep muscles, superficial muscles, skin. The stitches were even, tight. Not too tight so as not to cut off the blood supply. Not too loose so the wound wouldn't come apart. Garin lost consciousness on the 2nd stitch, and that was for the best. Dan finished. He rinsed the suture one more time with boiled water. He applied a bandage made of strips of linen fabric that he'd boiled beforehand. He told them to change the bandage every day, to keep the arm above the heart, to keep it dry, and to call him immediately if redness or heat developed around the suture. He went outside. He sat down on the doorstep. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from tension. He'd been pressing his finger against the artery for 40 minutes straight. His forearm muscles were burning. He sat there, staring at his hands. These hands had just saved a man's limb, maybe even his life, without any tools, without anesthesia, without antibiotics. Just knowledge, just technique, just boiling water and horsehair. A week later, Garin was wiggling his fingers. 2 weeks later, he was holding a hammer. 3 weeks later, he came to Dan and silently set a mug of beer in front of him. Dark, bitter, the best beer Dan had ever drunk in his life. And in this one, too. The village saw it all. The healer prayed, and the man was dying. The stranger cleaned the wound and stitched it up, and the man lived. It wasn't a miracle. It was a method, and the method could be repeated. Word of the healer from Tiki Dole began to spread throughout the region like smoke from a campfire, quietly, unnoticed, but unstoppably. By the end of the first month, Dan had stopped counting the days, not because he'd lost track, but because he no longer had time to count. He'd wake up before dawn, make his rounds among the patients, change their bandages, and give fluids to those who could still drink. He'd close the eyes of those for whom it was too late. He recorded every death. Not on paper, there was no paper here. On small wooden slats, with a piece of charcoal. Name, age, symptoms, how many days they'd been sick, cause of death. He kept records because he couldn't help but do so, because every death is data, and data is the key to understanding what went wrong and preventing it from happening again. It was second nature to him. A doctor who doesn't document isn't a doctor, he's a shaman. He implemented hand-washing like a military operation, methodically, without compromise. He placed a barrel of boiled water at the entrance to every house where there was a patient. He carved a sign out of wood and hung it on the door of the infirmary. 2 words were scratched onto the sign: "Wash your hands." At first, people looked at him as if he were crazy. Then they got used to it. They got used to it not because they believed him, but because the people who washed their hands got sick less often. It was obvious, tangible, irrefutable. By the end of the 3rd week, not a single child in the village had died of an intestinal illness. Before Dan arrived, children were dying from it every week. Just washing hands and boiling water. 2 actions, 0 cost. Hundreds of lives saved if scaled up. But Dan didn't think about scale. He thought about a specific child with a specific name. That was his strength, and that was his weakness. Leanne appeared toward the end of the 3rd week. She was 14, the innkeeper's daughter, slender, serious, a braid down to her waist. She didn't come to the infirmary as a patient. She came, sat down in a corner, and began to watch. Dan didn't notice her until an hour later. He asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to learn. He asked what. She said everything. He looked at her closely. She had dark eyes, and in those eyes was something he recognized immediately. A hunger, not a physical one. A hunger for knowledge, for meaning, for the chance to do something real. He'd seen that look in the mirror every morning for the past 10 years. He said, "All right, come sit closer. Watch. Remember." She remembered everything, the first time around. He showed her how to check a pulse. She repeated it. He showed her how to determine dehydration by skin turgor. She repeated it. He explained what a fever was and why the body heats up when it's fighting an illness. She listened without blinking. Then she asked, "What is an illness?" And Dan paused, because that was the most important question, the question to which this world had no right answer. He sat down next to her on the earthen floor of the infirmary and began to explain. He said that illness is neither a punishment nor a curse. It's tiny living creatures, so small that the eye cannot see them. They enter the body through dirty water, from unwashed hands, or through wounds. They live inside, multiply, and poison the blood. And the body fights them. The fever is that battle. And if you help the body, it will win. But if you don't help, it will lose. Leanne was silent for a long time. Then she asked how he knew all this. He said he'd studied for a long time. She asked where. He didn't answer. She didn't press him. From that day on, Leanne came every morning. She helped change the bandages. She boiled water. She prepared a saline solution. She kept records on small slates. Her handwriting was even and neat. Better than Dan's. He realized she was literate. That in a village where half the adults were illiterate, a 14-year-old girl could read and write. Her father, the innkeeper, had taught her, because he needed someone to keep the accounts. Dan began dictating to her rules for treating wounds, the recipe for saline solution, signs of dehydration, signs of blood poisoning, what to do for a burn, what to do for a fracture. Leanne wrote it all down, one wooden slat after another. These were the first medical records in the history of Quiet Hollow, the first seeds of a textbook. By the end of the month, Dan realized something else. He needed soap. Washing your hands with water is good. Washing your hands with soap is 10 times better. Soap existed here, but it was expensive and made in the cities. There was no soap in the village, Dan recalled. Soap is fat and lye. They have fat, pork, beef, any kind. Lye can be made from wood ash. Pour water over the ash, let it steep, strain it. Mix it with hot fat, stir it, let it cool. Soap. Simple, rough, smelly, but soap. He explained this to Leanne. She wrote it down. He asked the village headman for a tub for the ash. The village headman gave it to him, not because he believed in soap, because the blacksmith, Garen, told him that the healer knew what he was talking about. And no one in the village argued with the blacksmith. Dan made his first bar of soap 5 days later. It was brown and smelled like burnt fat, but it lathered, it foamed. It worked. Dan stood over the vat, holding in his hands a bar of something that, in his world, was worth 30 cents, but in this world could save thousands of lives. He looked at Leanne. She was staring at the soap, her eyes shining. Not out of delight, out of understanding. She already knew what it meant. And in that moment, Dan realized he had found his first student. A real one. The one who would carry on when he was gone. The one for whom all of this made sense. News of the epidemic in the neighboring village of Glinitsa came from a merchant. A thin man with sunken cheeks arrived in a cart and said that 10 people were dying every day in Glinitsa. Red fever. The same one that had struck Tiki Dol. Only worse. 3 times as many people, and no healer at all. Their healer was the first to die. Dan listened. He looked at the infirmary. 8 patients, 3 in critical condition. Leanne could handle the mild cases, but the critical ones? That was up to him. There was no one else. He stood in the doorway and felt 2 voices arguing inside him. One said he couldn't leave, that there were people here who depended on him, that if he left and someone died, he'd never forgive himself. The other said there were 10 corpses a day in Glinitsa. 10. A day. Arithmetic. Simple, brutal arithmetic. 3 in critical condition here, 10 dead there. He called Leanne over, sat down in front of her, looked her in the eyes, told her he was leaving, that it might be for a long time, that she would be in charge. She turned pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't cry. She didn't beg him to stay. She asked what to do if one of the critically ill patients started delirating. He explained. She asked what to do if an old wound started bleeding. He explained. She asked what to do if someone died. He paused. Then he said to close their eyes, cover them with a cloth, write down the name and date, and to keep working, because there were still living people nearby, and they were waiting. Leanne nodded. She was 14 years old, and the responsibility for 8 lives had fallen on her shoulders. Dan got ready in an hour. There was almost nothing to pack. A bag of strips of clean cloth, a pot of soap, a small bag of salt, a small bag of honey. Knowledge in his head. He set off in that very merchant's wagon. The journey took 2 days. Cold days, wet days. Autumn was already biting in the mornings. Glinitsa greeted him with a smell. That very smell. The smell of a typhus-ridden barracks that he knew from Sudan. Only here, the whole village was the barracks. Bodies lay by the road. They couldn't bury them fast enough. The living walked around with empty eyes. There was only one well, and a path led to it past the cesspit. Dan surveyed the village in 3 hours. He counted the sick, 62. Of those, 20 were in critical condition. Of the 20 in critical condition, perhaps half would survive, if they were lucky. He gathered those who were still on their feet, about 15 people, men, women, and teenagers. They looked at him warily. Some had heard of the doctor from Tikidol, others hadn't. It didn't matter to him. He began to speak, briefly, simply, as if giving orders. First, boil the water, all of it, always. Anyone who drinks unboiled water is signing their own death warrant. Second, wash your hands after every contact with the patient, after every trip to the outhouse, before every meal. There will be soap. He'll make some. Third, isolate the sick, the severely ill in one place, those with mild cases in another, the healthy in a third. Do not mix them. Fourth, move the outhouses further away from the well. Fill in the old ones with lime or ash. Fifth, bury the dead deep, deeper than usual, and do not touch their belongings with bare hands. People listened. Not everyone understood. Not everyone believed him. But they had no other doctor, and the corpses by the road were an argument that needed no explanation. Dan worked. The days turned into one long, murky blur of sweat and blood and boiling water and washing bandages and oral rehydration solution by the teaspoon every 2 minutes. He slept 3 hours a day, sometimes 2. He ate when he remembered he needed to. He was losing weight. His face had grown gaunt. His eyes were sunken. His hands shook with exhaustion by the end of each day. But he didn't stop, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the 10 who had died that day, and thought that if he'd arrived a day earlier, maybe it would have been 9 or 8. Toward the end of the second week, a woman appeared in Glenitza. She had come on foot, from the mountains. Her hair was cut short. A scar ran across her left eyebrow. Her gaze was like a knife. She approached Dan and said she was an herbalist from the Kavasan clan, that she had come to kill the foreign sorcerer who was stealing souls. Dan looked at her. He wasn't afraid. He was too exhausted to be afraid. He said that if she wanted to kill him, she should wait until morning, because right now he was tending to a woman with childbed fever, and if he got distracted, she would die. The herbalist looked at him. Then she looked at the woman in the corner. The woman was as hot as an oven. Her skin was gray. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Classic postpartum sepsis. Without antibiotics, her chances were close to 0. But Dan didn't have any antibiotics. He had his hands, and his knowledge, and a stubbornness that bordered on madness. He cleaned the wound. He drained it. He applied compresses soaked in a decoction of thyme and garlic. The antimicrobial properties were weak, but better than nothing. He gave her a solution to drink. He changed the compresses every 2 hours, all night long. The herbalist stood nearby. She didn't leave. She watched. By morning, the fever had begun to subside, not drastically, but noticeably. The woman opened her eyes. The herbalist was silent. Then she asked what his name was. He said his name was Dan. She said her name was May. She asked if she could stay. He said yes. May stayed. Dan spent in Glenitza a month. He returned to Tikidol by a wagon because that walk on my own is could. His couldn't hold me up. He lost 10 kilograms. His fingers on my hand were frozen. Fall had into early winter while he was treating someone else's village, and he didn't notice. May was sitting next to on the wagon and remained silent. For a month, she told him maybe be 100 words, but each in the matter. She knew the local herbs just Dan knew anatomies. The names that he had heard and properties that he could verify. But she knew that it and that didn't. Or rather, I thought that I knew. That's that in first very week of work, she discovered that 3 of her tried and true recipes that she used throughout her were poison. Not strong, slow, accumulative. Decoction of the root blue clover, which she gave from headache, was destroying the liver. Ointment made mountain resin that she rubbed into the wounds slowed down healing. The ash moss tincture she used for coughs made it hard to breathe. Dan figured this out from the symptoms, from how the patients reacted, from how some improved after May's treatment while others got worse. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse her. He sat down next to her by the campfire that evening and said quietly that some of her remedies were dangerous. May remained silent. Her expression didn't change, but Dan saw her knuckles turn white as she clenched her fists. She asked how many people she had killed. He said he didn't know, that no one knew, that she'd done the best she could with the knowledge she had. She said her mother had died in her arms 3 years ago, and that she'd treated her with that very same blue clover decoction. Dan didn't say anything. He just sat there beside her. A minute later, she stood up and walked off into the darkness. She returned in the morning, with red eyes and her back straight. She sat down across from him and said she was ready to learn. He said, "All right," and added one sentence that changed May forever. He told her not to bathe in it, to teach others not to repeat it. May didn't answer, but from that day on she wrote down his every word, not on slates, on pieces of birch bark, in small, sharp handwriting, like a knife across skin. In Quiet Valley, Leanne met them. She was standing on the porch of the infirmary, thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but she stood up straight. Dan asked how things were going. She said that 2 had died, Old Man Warren and Little Nita. She gave names, not numbers, not case numbers, names. Dan nodded. He asked about the others. She said the others were alive, that she'd changed their bandages as he'd shown her, boiled water, gave them the solution to drink, kept records. She handed him a stack of small wooden slats, neat, even lines, name, date, symptoms, treatment, outcome. Medical records. Real medical records kept by a 14-year-old girl in a village where half the people couldn't read or write. Dan took the slats. He looked at them. He looked at Leanne. He wanted to tell her she was doing a great job, that he was proud of her, that she had done the impossible. But instead, he told her she needed to get some sleep. She shook her head. He said it wasn't a request. She left. May watched her go. Then she looked at Dan. He didn't notice. He was already bent over the first patient. Winter in Quiet Valley was harsh. Snow had fallen in late fall and hadn't melted. The cold crept into the cracks of the infirmary like a living thing. Dan plugged the cracks with moss. He asked Garen, the blacksmith, to build a second stove. Garen did, without asking why. He just did it. Now there were 2 stoves in the infirmary, and it was warm. The patients stopped shivering at night. Dan began to think about expanding. The barn infirmary could hold 10 people. That wasn't enough. Sick people were being brought to him from the surrounding villages. Rumors were spreading. Someone had heard that there was a doctor in Quiet Valley. Someone had heard that the blacksmith had had his hand reattached. Someone had heard that the plague had been stopped in Glenitza. People were coming, in carts, on foot, carried in people's arms. Dan treated everyone. That was his rule. Anyone who came would be examined. Anyone who was sick would be treated, for free. No strings attached, no questions asked. He explained this to the village head when the man hesitantly suggested that perhaps they should charge a fee. Dan said that illness doesn't ask if you have money. Treatment shouldn't ask either. The village head didn't understand, but he didn't argue. May understood. Leanne understood. Garen shrugged and brought more firewood for the stoves. By midwinter, the infirmary was bursting at the seams. 15 patients in a room meant for 10. People were lying on the floor, in the hallways. Dan walked among them, stepping over their legs. He was exhausted. He didn't talk about it, but May could see it. She saw how he would sometimes freeze for a second with his eyes closed in the middle of his rounds, how his hands trembled more in the evening than in the morning, how he coughed in the mornings, a dry, short cough. She told him he was pushing himself too hard. He said he knew. She said that if he died, everyone else would die too, because he was the only one who knew how to treat them. He looked at her. She was right. He was the only point of failure. If he broke down, the whole system would collapse. And he made a decision, not a heroic one, a practical one. He began to teach. Not just Leanne, everyone he could. He gathered 4 women,
Leanne, May, the blacksmith, Garen's wife, and a sturdy, freckled woman named Elsa who feared nothing and knew how to hold a patient steady during surgery without looking away.
And the widow Anna, a quiet 40-year-old woman who had lost 3 children to typhus and had come to the infirmary because she had nowhere else to go. Dan taught them every evening for an hour, sometimes 2, after his rounds, when the patients had fallen asleep. He explained, demonstrated, and made them repeat: pulse, breathing, temperature, dressing, solution, dosage, cleanliness, cleanliness, cleanliness. He repeated that word so often that it became his nickname, Dr. Clean Hands. He didn't mind. He wouldn't have minded being called Dr. Clean Teeth either if it had helped. By the end of winter, he had 4 students, 4 pairs of hands besides his own, 4 people who knew how to properly clean a wound and apply a bandage, 4 people who knew that illness isn't a curse, but a living thing. 4 people. The beginning. Spring arrived with mud and hope. The snow was melting. The roads were turning into brown sludge. The carts got stuck in the hubs. But together with the mud came people, more people than before. They stretched toward the Pacific Valley with all directions, from villages from which Dan hadn't heard of, from places from I had names, with children in arms, with wounds on body, with eyes in which there one and that, the last hope. The infirmary barn any more could coping, 20 people in the room to 10. Dan was sleeping on porch wrapped up in a fur pelt, then stopped sleep on porch because that the porch was occupied by a patient. Garen came to him one morning, silently stood beside him. He looked at barn. He looked at the line at the entrance. Then he said that he might build a house, a real one, a log cabin, with 10 beds, with 2 stoves, with a floor, not dirt, but wood. Dan looked at him. He asked what they'd use to build it. Garen said there was a forest nearby. They had the manpower. The men in the village were sitting around with nothing to do because it was still too early to plant. All they needed was a reason. Dan asked what reason. Garen grinned. He said the reason was Dan. That half the village was alive thanks to him, and everyone knew it. Construction began 3 days later. Dan didn't build it. He treated the sick, but he drew up a plan on a piece of birch bark with charcoal. 10 beds, 2 rooms, 1 for severe cases, 1 for mild cases, a separate room for examinations, a stove in every room. Windows, real windows, not bull bladders, but frames with shutters that could be opened for ventilation. Ventilation. He explained to Garen why ventilation was necessary. Garen didn't understand, but he did it. 6 weeks later, the infirmary was ready. It smelled of fresh wood and resin. Dan stepped inside and paused. He ran his hand along the wall. Smooth logs, a level floor, clean beds, stuffed with hay, but clean. He stood there in silence. May followed him in. She stood beside him. She was silent too. Then she said it smelled nice. He nodded. His throat tightened, and he didn't want her to notice. But she did. She always noticed. The move took 2 days. The patients were carried on stretchers. Leanne oversaw their placement. She started a logbook, a real logbook on birch bark. Patient's name, bed, date of admission, diagnosis, prescriptions. A 14-year-old girl had organized a record-keeping system that was better than in half the hospitals Dan had seen in Sudan. He didn't tell her that. He said the bed numbers should go from the entrance toward the window, not the other way around. She looked at him. She corrected the numbering. She didn't argue. With the new clinic came new problems. Supplies. The fabric for bandages was running out. Honey was running out. Salt cost money that Dan didn't have. He made his own soap, but the lard cost money too. Dan had never thought about money. In Portland, he had a salary. In Sudan, the organization paid him. Here, there was neither a salary nor an organization. There were only patients whose numbers grew every day. The solution came from where he least expected it. A merchant. That same skinny guy from Glenitza. His name was Fergus. He transported goods between villages, fabrics, salt, grain, iron. He arrived in Tiki Dol with a load of flax and saw the clinic. He saw the line of people. He saw May bandaging a wound with a clean piece of cloth. He saw the soap. He stopped. He looked around. He walked up to Dan and asked how much the soap cost. Dan said the soap wasn't for sale. Fergus asked if Dan would sell him the soap if he brought 20 measures of salt and 10 rolls of flax. Dan thought for a moment. Fergus explained that in the cities, soap cost 1 silver coin per bar. In the villages, there's no soap at all. If he took soap from Quiet Hollow to the villages, he'd sell it cheaper than in the city and still make a profit. And Dan would get salt and cloth. Dan looked at May. May shrugged. She said it was up to him. He decided. Soap in exchange for supplies, not for sale, an exchange. The infirmary's first economic transaction. Fergus left with 20 bars of soap. He returned 2 weeks later with salt and flax and an order for 50 more bars. May made 50 bars in 4 days. She made soap better than Dan, faster, cleaner. Her hands knew fat and fire. Herbalists had worked with decoctions and infusions their whole lives. Soap-making came naturally to her. The clinic received supplies, clean cloth, salt, honey, oil, and candles. Dan could heal. He didn't have to worry about what to feed the patients tomorrow. He didn't have to count every strip of cloth. It was a relief he felt physically. It was as if someone had lifted a sack of stones from his shoulders. But along with the relief came fear. The clinic was growing. People were coming. Rumors were spreading. And where there are rumors, there is attention. The attention of those who disapprove of the clinic. The first sign appeared in late spring. A horseman, alone, in a dark cloak. He rode into Quiet Valley. He didn't stop. He didn't dismount. He rode slowly past the clinic. He looked. He turned around. He rode away. May stood at the window and watched him go. Her face was stony. Dan asked who it was. She said she didn't know, but the cloak, dark, no insignia, no coat of arms. That's how people ride who don't want to be recognized. People who have a reason to hide who sent them. Dan asked who could have sent him. May looked at him for a long time. Then she said one word. The Order. Dan knew bits and pieces about the Order of the Healers of Light, from conversations with patients, from what Garen said over a beer, from the way the village elder fell silent whenever the topic turned to priests. The Order controlled all healing in the Empire, any treatment, magical and otherwise. Only priests with a blessing had the right to heal. Everyone else was a heretic, a fine, prison, the stake. Dan healed without a blessing, without prayer, without magic, and people recovered. To the Order, this was worse than heresy. It was proof that their monopoly was a lie. May told him he needed to be more careful. Dan said he healed people and wasn't going to hide. May said that the dead don't heal anyone. He looked at her. She was right. She was often right. It annoyed him and reassured him at the same time. Summer was hot and short. Dan was working. He treated patients. He taught. He fell asleep at the table over birch bark sheets on which I tried to write textbook. I would wake up from that Lien was quietly watch his shoulders with a blanket. He was pretend that didn't notice. She was pretend that wasn't was doing. In the middle of summer, by he already 17 female students and male students. Not all were capable. Not everyone stayed. But the core held firm. Leanne, May, Elsa, Anna, and the newcomers. Guy by named Tom from a neighboring village. The silent one, strong, with his hands that didn't tremble as the sight of blood. The girl by named Helen, the daughter of shepherd, redhead, loud. She argued with Dan with every issue, but when he explained why she was wrong, she listened and remembered. Dan loved those who argued. They learned faster.
He divided the training into stages. The first stage, cleanliness, washing, boiling water.
Sterilizing of instruments. Sterility dressings. Without this, The second stage. Diagnosis. Pulse, breathing, temperature, skin of the skin, smell, sounds in chest. Dan didn't have stethoscope. He asked Garen to make a wooden pipe, a long one, hollow, with a widening on one end. Garen did it. Dan applied it to the patient and heard rails, wheezing, heartbeats. Not so clear as through a real stethoscope, but that's enough. He taught Leanne to listen. She learned in 2 days, May in 3. Elsa so and never learned to distinguish wheezing from normal breathing, but she learned something else. She learned observation. Nail color, the color of the whites of the eyes, swelling on the ankles, a rash on the abdomen. Elsa could diagnose a patient with her eyes better than Dan could with his ears. Stage 3. Treatment. Dressings. Cleaning wounds. Applying splints for fractures. Preparing decoctions. Dosages. May led this stage alongside Dan. She knew the local plants. He knew the principles. Together they compiled a list. Willow bark for fever and pain, an aspirin substitute. Dan remembered that willow bark contains salicin. Willows grew here. He found them on the bank of a stream. He stripped the bark, dried it, ground it into a powder, brewed it, gave it to a patient with a high fever. The fever dropped by 1.5 degrees in 2 hours. Not magic, pharmacology. May watched this with an expression Dan couldn't read. Then she said her mother used to drink willow decoction for joint pain, that it had worked, but she didn't know why. Now she knows. Dan nodded. Garlic, thyme, antiseptics, weak but effective. He prepared tinctures. He washed wounds with them. The results were better than those from spiderwebs and cow manure, significantly better. Gorna, the herbalist, watched all this with growing horror. She didn't interfere, but she didn't help either. She stood aside and shook her head. Dan left her alone. He understood that she was losing everything, her place, her purpose, her world. For her, illness was a spiritual trial, and healing came through prayer. But this stranger was boiling bark and washing hands, and people were getting better. It was the destruction of everything she had believed in for 60 years. One evening she came to him, old, hunchbacked, with trembling hands. She asked if it was true that diseases were living creatures. Dan said it was true. She asked, "What about the gods?" Dan paused. Then he said he didn't know if there were gods, but he knew there were little creatures that killed people, and he knew how to fight them. As for the gods, let them sort it out among themselves. Gorna looked at him. Then she snorted. She said he was insolent. She stood up and left. The next morning she came to the clinic with a basket of fresh herbs and asked if she could help. Dan gave her a job, a simple one, drying the herbs, sorting through them, and organizing them. Gorna worked quietly and carefully. She knew the names of 300 plants. Dan knew the properties of maybe 50. Together, they covered more. Summer brought yet another problem, the Baron. His name was Edgar Hallstock. He owned Quiet Hollow and a dozen other villages in the surrounding area. Technically, everything that happened on his land required his approval. Technically, every resident was his subject. Dan, too. Baron Hallstock had not paid any attention to Quiet Hollow until now. The village was far away, poor, unremarkable. But rumors of the clinic had reached the Baron's castle. One morning, a detachment rode up to the clinic, 6 horsemen, armed, wearing the Baron's colors. The commander dismounted. He went inside. He looked around. He saw Dan bent over a patient. He said that Baron Hallstock was summoning the doctor to the castle, personally, immediately. Dan didn't look up. He was stitching up a laceration on the leg of a teenager who had stepped on a rusty nail. He said he was busy, that he'd come when he was finished. The commander flushed. He repeated that it was immediate. May stepped between him and Dan, silently. The commander looked at her, at the scar across her eyebrow, at her eyes. He decided he would wait. Dan finished an hour later. He went with them. The Baron's castle was made of stone and was cold even in the summer. Baron Hallstock turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s with gouty fingers and the red nose of a man who drinks every day. He sat in a high-backed armchair and looked down at Dan, literally. The armchair stood on a raised platform. The Baron said he'd heard about the doctor, that he was impressed, that he wanted to offer him a position at court as the Baron's personal physician with housing, food, a salary, and protection. Dan listened. Then he said he was grateful for the offer and that he was declining. The Baron didn't understand. Dan explained that his place was at the clinic, that there were people there who needed him every day, that he couldn't treat just one person when hundreds were sick. The Baron said it wasn't a request. Dan said he understood and that he was still refusing. The Baron flushed. He said that Dan lived on his land. He practiced medicine on his land without his permission. Dan said that he heals people and doesn't need permission to do so. The Baron stood up. He was a head taller than Dan, twice as heavy. He said the doctor had a cheeky tongue, that a cheeky tongue could be cut short. Dan looked up at him without looking away. He wasn't brave. He was tired. Tired people aren't very afraid. He said the Baron could do whatever he wanted to him, but the clinic would remain, and the students would continue their work, and the knowledge wouldn't disappear. The Baron was silent. Dan turned and walked away. They didn't stop him. He didn't know why. Maybe the Baron was surprised. Maybe he didn't have the nerve. Maybe his gout distracted him. On the way back, Dan realized his hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the fact that he'd just defied an armed feudal lord who could have killed him with a single word. May was waiting for him on the porch. She looked at his face. She didn't ask anything. She held out a mug of hot herbal tea. He took it. He sat down. He drank. He was silent. May sat down beside him. She was silent too. The two of them sat on the porch of the sanatorium and watched the sun sink below the horizon. It was quiet. It was almost good. Fall of the second year. Dan considered the time by the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. 1.5 circles. 18 months in this world. He got used to it. Not to the world, to myself in this world. His hands had become rough from boiling water and washing the bandages. His face was weathered. He grew a beard because that shaving I nothing in no time. May once said that his suits looks good on him. Just an ordinary day. Amid discussing the dosage willow decoction and dressing for a burn, he didn't find what to say. The clinic is now like a machine. Not perfect, creaky, but it worked. Morning rounds, afternoon treatments, evening lessons, night shifts. Leanne kept the schedule. May was in charge of herbs and soap making. Elsa handled dressings. Tom took care of the difficult cases that required physical strength, holding the patient during dislocation reduction, lifting and carrying, not letting go when it hurt. Tom was built for this, quiet, reliable, like a wall. Dan began writing a textbook in earnest, not on wooden tablets or birch bark. Fergus brought him paper, real paper, rough, yellowish, but paper. Dan wrote every evening, 1 page, sometimes 2, in the local language, which by this point he knew well enough to explain anything. He started with anatomy. He drew a skeleton. He drew the organs. He labeled every bone, every organ, its function, its location, what happens when it's damaged. Leanne sat next to him and looked at the drawings. She asked how he knew what a person looked like on the inside. Dan said he'd studied. She asked what he'd studied on. He said on dead bodies. She didn't flinch. She nodded. She asked if she could do it too. Dan looked at her. She was 15. In this world, women gave birth to children and buried their husbands at 15. She was more mature than most of the adults he knew. He said she could, when the opportunity arose. The opportunity presented itself a week later. An old man, a vagrant. He'd died on the road, No name, no family. The body was brought to the clinic. Dan performed the autopsy. The first autopsy in the history of Quiet Hollow. Leanne and May were present. The others refused. Gorna left the clinic and didn't return for 3 days. Dan pointed out the lungs, the liver, heart, intestines, kidneys. He explained quietly and calmly, like in a lecture, without emotion, without drama. This is the body. These are the organs. This is how they work. This is how they break down. This is how we fix them. Leanne took notes. She drew. Her drawings were better than his own, more accurate, more detailed. She saw what he missed: small blood vessels, ligaments, the texture of the tissues. May remained silent throughout the entire autopsy. Then she left. Dan found her behind the clinic. She was standing there, looking into the forest. He asked how she was doing.
She said she'd seen internal organs hundreds of times, animals, people who'd been killed in front of her. But she'd never seen them like this, calmly, with an explanation, as if the body were a map and every organ a city on that map. She said it changed everything. Dan didn't answer. He knew what had changed. In mid-fall, the Inquisitor arrived, not a horseman in a dark cloak, a real Inquisitor, with the Order's seal on his chest, accompanied by 2 soldiers. His name was Brother Cassian. Young, around 30, handsome in that cold, precise way that people raised within the sterile walls of a temple tend to be. He arrived and asked permission to inspect the infirmary, politely, too politely. Dan agreed. He showed him everything: the beds, the patients, the herbal supplies, soap, bandages, instruments. Brother Cassian looked. He touched things. He sniffed. He asked questions, intelligent questions. He asked how Dan treated fever. Dan explained. Rest, plenty of fluids, compresses to lower the temperature, willow bark decoction. Cassian asked, "And what about prayer?" Dan said he didn't pray. Cassian asked, "What about a blessing?" Dan said he didn't have a blessing. Cassian asked, "Then by what right do you treat people?" Dan said, "By the right of knowledge." Cassian smiled, a subtle, precise smile. He said that knowledge without a blessing is heresy. Dan said that knowledge is knowledge. With or without a blessing, it works. Cassian stopped smiling. He spent 3 days in Quiet Valley. He watched Dan deliver a baby. He saw May dressing a burn. He saw Leanne keeping records. He saw a little girl with a wound on her leg who a week ago hadn't been able to walk run out of the clinic laughing. He saw the soap and the barrels of boiled water and the clean floors. He saw the results. The results were undeniable. On the 3rd day, he left, silently, without saying goodbye. May watched him go and said that this was only the beginning. Dan knew. He knew that Cassian would write a report, that the report would reach someone higher up, that someone higher up would make a decision, and that the decision would not be in the clinic's favor. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't close the doors. He couldn't stop treating patients. It was the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing that made sense. That evening, May came to see him. He was sitting at the table, writing a textbook. She sat down across from him. She poured him some tea. She poured herself some too. They drank in silence. Then she said it in passing, as if she were talking about the weather or the dosage of time infusion. She said she loved him. Dan looked up. He looked at her. She was looking right at him, without embarrassment, without expectation. Just a fact, like a patient's temperature, like the season. He opened his mouth, closed it. She raised her hand, said he didn't need to say anything in response, that she just wanted him to know. She finished her tea, stood up, left. Dan sat at the table and stared at the page of the textbook. It had a diagram of the lungs on it. He looked at them but didn't see them. He was thinking about May, about the scar across her eyebrow, about her hands that always smelled of thyme and soap, about the way she'd said those words, just the way she said everything else, precisely, briefly, without any fuss. He didn't know what he was feeling. He knew he felt warm, truly warm, for the first time in 18 months. Winter of the second year struck early and harshly. The cold came at late af and did not retreat. The stream froze over. We had to melt from snow. We burned faster than we could prepare. Patients became fewer because that the roads were, and get to Tico Dola could only the one who lived nearby. But those who made it there were in worse shape than usual. Frostbite, broken bones. People fell on the ice and broke their legs, arms, and ribs. Dan set the brakes and applied splints. He made the splints out of sticks and strips of cloth. Simple, rough. It worked. One night, they brought in a woman, a young woman, pregnant, bleeding. The placenta hadn't been delivered. She'd been bleeding for an hour. Her face was pale, her pulse was faint. Dan acted quickly. He knew this situation. He'd seen it 5 times in Sudan. He'd saved her 3 times. Twice he hadn't. He didn't think about the 2 times he'd failed. He thought about the 3 times he'd succeeded. He asked for boiling water, clean rags, light, more light. Leanne brought candles, 6 of them. She arranged them around the table. Shadows danced on the walls. Dan worked with his hands. His hands remembered what to do. His mind shut out everything except the wound, the body, and the baby. The baby was alive, small, red, screaming. Dan handed him to May. May wrapped him in a warm cloth. Dan returned to the mother. The bleeding wouldn't stop. He massaged her uterus through her abdomen. He pressed, hard. It hurt. The woman screamed. He didn't stop, because if he stopped, she would die. 10 minutes later, the bleeding began to slow. 20 minutes later, it stopped. An hour later, the woman was asleep, pale, alive. Her baby lay beside her, also asleep. Dan stepped out onto the porch. He sat down on a step. The frost stung his sweat-dampened face. He closed his eyes. Inside, he felt empty. Not bad, not good. Empty. That's how it was after every time he managed to pull someone back from the very edge, as if he'd given up a part of himself and was now waiting for it to grow back. May came out after him. She sat down beside him. She placed her hand on his. She didn't say anything. He didn't pull his hand away. They sat there in the cold until Leanne came out and said they were both crazy and that she wasn't going to treat 2 frostbitten doctors. Dan smiled wryly. He stood up. He went inside. A week after that night, mercenaries arrived in Quiet Hollow. 5 of them, battered, bloodied, one on a stretcher. Their commander was a woman, tall, slender, with tattoos on her forearms. She entered the infirmary carrying a man on her shoulder who was twice her weight. She laid him on an empty bed. She turned to Dan. She said her man was wounded, an arrow in the stomach, 3 days ago. She'd pulled out the shaft, but the tip was still inside. She said this the way people talk about the weather, calmly, businesslike, as if an arrow in the stomach were a minor, everyday nuisance. Dan examined the wounded man. His abdomen was distended and hard. He had a high fever. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Peritonitis. The arrowhead had pierced the intestine. The contents of the intestine had leaked into the abdominal cavity. Infection. Without surgery, death within a day. Maybe 2. Dan looked at the woman. He told her the odds were poor, that he'd try, that it might not work. She nodded. She told him to try. Dan operated for 8 hours, through the night, by candlelight. May assisted. Leanne handed him the instruments. Tom held the wounded man when he came to and howled in pain. Dan opened the abdominal cavity. He found the tip. He pulled it out. He found a ruptured intestine. He sutured it. He rinsed the cavity with boiled water infused with thyme. He sutured the peritoneum. He sutured the skin, stitch by stitch, with horsehair, boiled. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows. His back was burning from 8 hours of leaning over. His eyes were watering from the candle smoke. But his hands didn't tremble, not once in 8 hours. The wounded man survived, not right away. There was a week when Dan thought he wouldn't make it. The fever wouldn't break. The wound was festering. Dan changed the bandages 3 times a day. He washed the wound. He drained it. He gave him herbal tea to drink. He didn't sleep near his cot for 2 days straight. On the 8th day, the fever began to subside. On the 10th, the wounded man opened his eyes and asked for water. On the 14th, he was sitting up. By the 21st, he was standing. By the 28th, he was walking. His commander had been by his side the whole time. She didn't leave. She didn't walk away. She sat on a stool by his cot and sharpened a knife. Dan learned that her name was Raven, Ray, that her unit was called the Black Claws, that they were mercenaries. They'd been working for a trading house. They'd run into a bandit ambush, lost 2 men. The rest were wounded. When her man was back on his feet, Ray approached Dan. She looked at him with her direct, unblinking gaze. She said she belonged to him now, by contract, for life. Dan said he didn't hire mercenaries. Ray said she wasn't asking. She was paying a debt, a life for a life. She and her squad would stay at the clinic, as guards, for protection, for free, as long as she was alive. Dan wanted to object, but he looked at May. May nodded ever so slightly. Dan looked at Ray. He said okay. Ray grinned, widely, openly, the first real smile he'd ever seen on her face. She slapped him on the shoulder so hard he staggered and told him not to you dare die, because then she'd have to find another doctor, and there's no one else like him. The infirmary had hired security, 3 fighters, Ray, her one-eyed, taciturn lieutenant named Boris, and the archer, Sal, small, quick, and as vicious as a wasp. They set up a tent next to the infirmary. Ray patrolled the surroundings every morning. Boris stood at the door and, by his very presence alone, scared off everyone who needed to be scared off. Sal shot hares and replenished their meat supplies. Dan suddenly felt safe. It was a strange, long-forgotten feeling. He didn't know what to make of it. The spring of the 2nd year brought 2 events. The first was good. The second was not. The good event was Leanne. She turned 16. Dan didn't know the exact date. They didn't celebrate birthdays here. But Leanne said she was turning 16 that month, and Dan nodded, not letting on that he was thinking about how quickly time had passed. 2 years ago, she had been a frightened, skinny girl who had come into the barn and sat in a corner. Now she was his best student. She made diagnoses. She dressed wounds. She handled easy deliveries on her own. She kept records that were impeccable. She knew by heart the 40 pages of the textbook Dan had written. She could explain to a peasant woman why she should wash her hands in a way that the woman understood and obeyed. It was a talent, not a medical one, but a human one. The ability to speak to people so that they would listen. Dan couldn't do that. He was good with patients one-on-one, but in front of a group, he lost his footing. He mumbled. He mixed up his words. Leanne spoke clearly and simply, and people believed her. She was ready. Dan knew it. He told her it was time. That in the village of Cornwall, 20 versts to the north, there was neither a doctor nor a traditional healer. That people there were dying from things they shouldn't be dying from. That he wanted to open a medical clinic there, and that he wanted Leanne to run it. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "Alone?" He said, "Alone." With a supply of herbs, bandages, and soap, with a copy of the textbook, with everything he'd instilled in her over the past 2 years. She asked, "What if I can't handle it?" He said she would. She asked, "What if someone dies?" He said someone would die, that people die, that it's inevitable, that what matters isn't how many die, but how many survive, and that without her, no one in Cornwall would survive. She pressed her lips together, nodded, said she'd go. Dan walked her to the edge of the village. She walked alongside the wagon carrying her belongings, a bag of tools, a bundle of birch bark with notes, a pot of soap, and small bags of herbs, everything she needed to save lives. She turned around at the edge of the road and looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said what they were thinking. She turned and walked away. Dan stood there watching her until the cart disappeared around the bend. Then he returned to the clinic. He sat down at the table. He opened his textbook. The letters blurred. He rubbed his eyes. He told himself it was just fatigue. May walked in. She looked at him. She said nothing. She set a cup of tea in front of him. He drank it. The second incident occurred 3 weeks after Leanne's departure. Baron Hallstock sent men. Not an invitation, not a polite officer. 20 armed soldiers. At night, with torches. The squad commander read out the Baron's order. The clinic was to be closed, the healer arrested, the property confiscated, the grounds treating patients without the signor's permission. Heresy, a breach of order. Ray stepped out onto the porch with a sword in her hand. Boris stood beside her. Sel climbed onto the roof with her bow. 3 people against 20. The odds were lopsided. But Ray stood the way people stand when they have no intention of backing down. Calm, weary, with a faint smile that was more terrifying than any snarl. Dan followed her out. He stood in front of Ray, between her and the soldiers. He said he was a doctor, that there were patients in the infirmary, that there were children among them, that if the soldiers went in, people would get hurt. The commander said he didn't care. An order is an order. And then the blacksmith Garen stepped out of the darkness. Behind him were his apprentices. Behind them were the men from the village, with axes, with pitchforks, with stakes. Not 10, not 20, more than 40. The whole village. They stood behind Dan, silently. No one said a word. They just stood there. The blacksmith with the hand Dan had saved. The father of the boy Dan had nursed back to health on the first day. The mother of the girl whose leg Dan had stitched up. The husband of the woman Dan had saved from childbed fever. Each of them was there because Dan had saved someone they loved. The commander looked at the crowd. He did the math. 20 soldiers against 40 villagers, plus 3 professional fighters. The odds were bad. He turned and walked away. The torches faded into the darkness. The village stood still, silent. Then Garen turned to Dan and said he was running out of beer and asked if the healer could take a look at his wife because she was complaining about her lower back again. Dan exhaled. He laughed. For the first time in a long time, he laughed for real. Ray sheathed her sword. She patted Garen on the shoulder. She said she liked the blacksmith. Garen blushed and mumbled something unintelligible. The night ended without bloodshed. But Dan knew the Baron wouldn't back down, that this was a test, the first attempt. There would be others. May knew it too. She said they needed allies, real ones, not villagers with pitchforks, those who carried weight, those the Baron feared. Dan asked who she meant. May said she didn't know, but she knew what they had to look for. Because you can't fend off the order with Ray's sword and Garen's pitchfork. Dan nodded. She was right. Again. He was starting to get used to the fact that she was right. It didn't annoy him anymore. It was reassuring. An ally arrived on his own. A month after the nighttime raid on the clinic, a carriage, a real carriage, with the coat of arms on the door, with a coachman in livery, with security of 4 riders in well-armored armor. Ray put her hand at the sword. Boris narrowed his one eye. A woman stepped out of the carriage. She was young, about 24. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun. Her back was straight. She had a cold, beautiful face that was accustomed to revealing nothing. Her dress was expensive but travel-friendly, practical. She didn't look like a peasant woman. She looked like someone accustomed to giving orders. She approached the porch. She looked at Ray, at Boris, at the clinic. Then she asked in a quiet, even voice where the doctor was. Dan came out. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said her name was Constance Wellmore, that she was the youngest daughter of the Wellmore family, that her family had been disgraced and banished from the capital for supporting the wrong faction at court, that she had nowhere to go, and that her brother was dying, She said all this in a single tone, without pauses, without a tremor in her voice, like a memorized report. Only her hands gave her away. She was clenching her gloves so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan asked what was wrong with her brother. She said he had seizures, that he would fall, thrashing about, rolling his eyes back, foaming at the mouth. 3 times a week, sometimes more often. That the Order of Healers had refused to treat him, declared him cursed. That other healers were afraid. That she'd heard about a healer from the Wastelands and had come. Dan told her to bring her brother. His brother's name was Elliot. He was 17, thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes and thin hands that trembled. He walked in on his own, not on a stretcher. He sat down on the cot. He looked at Dan with the expression of someone who'd been promised help so many times that he'd stopped believing it. Dan examined him, asked him questions. When did the seizures start? How often? Are there any warning signs? Elliot answered briefly. Yes, no, I don't know. Sometimes he sees flashes before his eyes. Sometimes he'd smell a strange odor, then darkness. Then he'd wake up on the floor and everything hurt. Dan listened. He figured it out. Epilepsy, classic, generalized tonic-clonic seizures with an aura. In his world, that was a diagnosis. A pill in the morning, a pill in the evening. Life. There were no pills here, but there were plants. Dan thought for 2 days. He went over everything he knew in his mind. Valerian, sedative effect, weak but present. Motherwort, also weak. Mistletoe, anticonvulsant properties described in old pharmacopoeias, dosage unknown, risk of poisoning. He discussed this with May. She knew of a local equivalent to valerian, the sleep-colored root. She said that mountain clans give it to their warriors before bed after a battle to calm their tremors. Dan asked her to bring some. She did. He began adjusting the dosage, carefully, a pinch at a time, watching closely, taking notes, every day. The first week. A seizure on the 3rd day. Dan increased the dose. The second week, a seizure on the 5th day. He added mistletoe. The 3rd week, no seizures. The 4th, no seizures. Elliot looked at Dan with an expression Dan couldn't bear. Hope. A quiet, cautious hope that was afraid of itself. Constance stood by his side all 4 weeks. She didn't leave. She didn't sleep in the carriage. She slept on a bench at the sanatorium. She helped. Awkwardly at first. She didn't know how to do anything with her hands. She was an aristocrat. Her hands were used to a quill and reins, not rags and boiling water. But she learned, silently, stubbornly, gritting her teeth. She washed the bandages, carried water, scrubbed the floors. Her hands were chapped and red by the end of the first week. May silently handed her some beeswax ointment. Constance took it. She didn't say thank you. May didn't expect thanks. By the end of the month, Elliot was walking. He was smiling. He hadn't had a seizure in 3 weeks. Dan told Constance that this wasn't a cure, that the disease was still there, that the decoction reduced the frequency of the seizures but didn't eliminate the cause, that he'd have to take it for the rest of his life, that the dosage would need to be adjusted, that it wasn't a miracle, it was management. Constance looked at him. For the first time in a month, her face twitched. She said that all her life she'd been told her brother was cursed, that the gods had turned their backs on him, that treatment was useless. And in 4 weeks, he'd done what no one else had. Dan said he hadn't done anything special. He'd just picked some herbs. She said he didn't understand, that to her, this was everything. She didn't cry, but her eyes were shining. She turned away quickly, so he wouldn't see. He saw. Constance stayed, not as a patient, not as a student, as something the sanatorium desperately lacked, as a politician. She knew how power worked. She knew who owed whom, who feared whom, who was making deals with whom. She wrote 3 letters in the very first week, to the Graves Trading House, which controlled the salt mines to the west, to the widow of Count Alaran, who owned the Free City, and to the secret envoy of the younger Prince Oswald, who was seeking allies in the provinces. Dan asked why. She said that a sanatorium isn't just about beds and soap. It's an idea. The idea that people can be treated without the order. That idea is dangerous, and a dangerous idea can only be protected if it becomes profitable to those who hold power. Dan said he didn't like the word profitable. Constance said she didn't either, but the dead like it even less. He looked at her. She looked right at him, coldly, pragmatically, like a surgeon looking at a wound. He realized she was thinking the same way he was, only not about bodies, about systems, about structures, about how the world works and how it can be changed without destroying it.
He nodded. He said, "All right, go ahead." She did. Sister Yona arrived quietly, without a carriage, without guards, on a mule, in the gray habit of a novice from a small church. She knocked on the clinic's door that morning and said Bishop Torvald had sent her, to look, to listen, to report. She said it plainly, without guile. Dan appreciated that. He asked what exactly the bishop had ordered her to report. She said he had ordered her to report whether there was heresy. Dan asked what she thought. She said she didn't know yet. That was why she had come. She was 22, light hair under a gray scarf, large gray eyes, a quiet voice, her hands folded in front of her as if in prayer. She looked like someone who had spent her whole life trying to be invisible and had almost succeeded. Dan said she could watch. She could walk around the clinic. She could talk to the patients. She could attend rounds. He wasn't hiding anything. Yona stayed. On the first day, she sat in a corner and watched. On the second day, too. On the third day, Dan was delivering a baby. It was a difficult delivery. The baby was in a breech position. Dan worked for 3 hours. May assisted. Yona sat in her corner and watched. Dan turned the baby around, pulled it out. Alive. The mother was alive. Dan handed the baby to May. He sat down on the floor, closed his eyes, opened them. He saw that Yona was standing next to him. She wasn't sitting in the corner. She was standing next to him, and her eyes were wet. She whispered, asking why he was crying. He didn't understand. He touched his face. It was wet. He was crying. He hadn't noticed. He said the baby was alive, but the other one wasn't. A twin. He hadn't been able to save both of them. One had already been dead when labor began. He'd known that from the very first minutes. But he couldn't tell the mother, not now. He'd tell her later, when she'd regained her strength. Yona looked at him, at his blood-stained hands, at his face wet with tears he hadn't noticed, at the living baby in May's arms, at the dead one wrapped in a cloth on the neighboring bed. She was silent. Then she said one sentence, quietly, almost inaudibly. She said that if God existed, this is exactly what he would have done. Dan looked at her. She turned away and left. That evening, she wrote a letter to Bishop Torvald. Dan didn't ask what she had written. A week later, he found out from Constance, who intercepted and read all correspondence passing through the district. Yona wrote that no heresy had been found, that the healer treated patients with herbs and cleanliness, that he does not offer prayers, but neither does he blaspheme, that people are recovering, that she is asking for permission to stay for further observation. Constance said this was a good sign, that Bishop Torvald is no friend of the order, that he is one of those priests who remember that the church should serve the people, not the other way around, that Yona could become a bridge to that part of the clergy that is also dissatisfied with the order's monopoly. Dan said that Yona is not a bridge, Yona is a person. Constance looked at him with an expression that meant he was a hopeless idealist. He looked at her with an expression that meant, yes, Yona stayed. She helped. She didn't heal, she didn't have the skills, but she had other talents. She knew how to talk to people so that they would calm down, the dying, the frightened, those who had lost hope. Yona would sit beside them, take their hand, speak softly, no prayers, just words, that the pain would pass, that they weren't alone, that someone was there. Dan saw how patients slept more peacefully after talking with her, how their heart rates slowed, how the tension faded from their faces. He knew it wasn't magic. It was compassion. Simple human compassion that works better than half the medications. Once he told her that she had saved a man that day. He was referring to an old man who had been brought in with heart failure. The old man was gasping for breath. He was panicking. The panic was making his shortness of breath worse. The shortness of breath was making the panic worse. A vicious cycle. Dan gave him an herbal decoction. May applied a compress. But it was Yona who sat down beside him and spoke to him for 20 minutes in a quiet, steady voice until his breathing evened out. Dan told her that she had saved a man's life, that nothing else was needed. Yona looked at him. She turned away. She left. May found her behind the infirmary. She was crying. May didn't ask why. She just sat down next to her and remained silent until Yona stopped. Then Yona said that her whole life she'd felt inadequate, not holy enough, not pure enough, not worthy enough. That her prayers were empty, that God didn't hear her. But today she'd been told she'd saved a person, just with words, just by being there. And if that was true, then maybe she wasn't useless. May said she wasn't useless. She said it briefly and firmly, just as she said everything. Yona smiled, subtly, tearfully, but she smiled. The clinic was growing. 7 medical clinics were operating in the surrounding villages. Leanne managed 2, Tom managed 1, Helen managed 1. 3 clinics were run by students whom Dan had trained over the past year. May was making soap on an industrial scale. Fergus was delivering it throughout the district. Constance was handling negotiations. Ray was providing security. Yona served as the liaison with the temple. Sarah hadn't arrived yet, but Dan already sensed that the clinic was no longer just him. It was an organism, alive, breathing, with its own hands, eyes, and voice. He had created something that could live without him. The thought both delighted and frightened him. Sarah Kim arrived in the fall. She was brought in on a cart, wrapped in rags and wheezing. Her chronic bronchitis had progressed to the point where every breath sounded like the creak of rusty hinges. Dan examined her and, first of all, asked what she'd been treated with before. She replied in flawless Imperial with a slight Eastern accent that it was mercury vapor. Dan closed his eyes, opened them, asked again. Mercury vapor. She confirmed it. The local pharmacist, 3 two-week courses. Mercury supposedly cleanses the lungs of impurities. Dan sat down. He rubbed his face with his hands. Mercury doesn't cleanse the lungs. Mercury kills the lungs and the kidneys and the brain. This girl was alive only because she had been young and healthy before the treatment began. He started by stopping the poisoning, flushing, plenty of fluids, decoctions of expectorant herbs, steam inhalations with thyme, fresh air, rest. No mercury, no amulets, no crushed beetles. After 2 weeks, Sarah was breathing evenly. After 3 weeks, she stopped wheezing. After a month, she was back on her feet. She turned out to be a petite young woman with straight black hair and the sharp gaze of someone accustomed to taking in everything around her. She was the daughter of a trade envoy from an Eastern power. She was stranded in the empire because of the war in her homeland. She knew 6 languages. She understood accounting. She knew how to politely turn people down so that they left satisfied. She looked at the infirmary, at the chaos of supplies piled in the corner, at the stacks of birch bark with notes that no one had organized, at the line of patients that no one had organized, at May, who was simultaneously making soap, bandaging a wound, and scolding Tom for getting the dosage wrong. Sarah asked if they kept records. Dan said that Leanne used to. Sarah asked, "And now?" Dan remained silent. With Leanne's departure, the record-keeping had fallen apart. Records were kept haphazardly, supplies would run out unexpectedly, soap was handed out without being counted. The money Constance had started raising was being spent haphazardly. Sarah said she could help. Dan said he'd be grateful. A week later, the clinic was a different place.
Sarah recounted everything, every bar of soap, every roll of gauze, every bag of salt, every bundle of herbs. She started a ledger, a real paper ledger that Fergus had brought. Incoming, outgoing, balance. She drew up a duty roster, a delivery schedule, and a training schedule. She arranged with Fergus for regular trips, once every 2 weeks. She set salaries for the students, small ones, but salaries nonetheless, because people can't work for free forever. Dan watched all this and felt as if another sack of stones was being lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know how to manage. He knew how to heal. Sarah knew how to manage. Together, they covered both sides. At night, the two of them sat together poring over paperwork. Dan was writing a textbook. Sarah was calculating expenses. They spoke quietly so as not to wake the patients, about the clinic, about their plans, about how much a single medical outpost cost per year, about how much soap they needed to produce to cover expenses, about how many students they needed to train to meet the needs of 10 villages. Dan once asked her why she was doing this, why she was here. She could leave. She could find the embassy. She could go back to her old life. Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she said she had no life to return to, that there was a war in her homeland, that she was a stranger in the empire, that her whole life she had been the ambassador's daughter, a tool, a bargaining chip, that here, for the first time, someone had told her she was needed just as she was, not as someone's daughter, not as a bride for a profitable marriage, as a person who knows how to do what she does, and that's valuable. Dan didn't remember saying that, but apparently he had, or he'd done something that meant the same thing. Sarah looked at him by candlelight. He looked at her. Between them lay the ledger and 3 stubs of charcoal pencils, the romance of bookkeeping. He smiled. She smiled. They returned to the numbers. Meanwhile, Constance had received a reply to her letters. Graves' trading house was interested. Healthy peasants are working peasants. Working peasants mean taxes and trade. A sanatorium is an investment. Cold calculation, but a calculation that aligned with Dan's goals. The widow of Count Alaran invited Dan to the Free City for a conversation. Constance said it was important that Alaran was neutral territory, a free city. Neither the Baron nor the Order held full authority there. If Dan gained Alaran's support, he would gain a foothold, a place where he could speak openly, a place where he wouldn't be burned at the stake. Dan asked when to go. Constance said in the spring. Dan nodded. He had half a year to prepare. He knew what for. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. The microscope. Dan spent the winter working on 2 projects, a textbook and a microscope. The textbook grew page by page: anatomy, diagnostics, hygiene, obstetrics, wound care, infectious diseases, poisoning, fractures and dislocations, medicinal plants. Each section is written in simple language, short sentences, clear explanations, drawings, lots of drawings. Leanne came from Cornwall for a week and drew all the anatomical illustrations. Her drawings were more accurate and easier to understand than his own. Dan looked at them and thought that in 500 years, historians would argue over who had drawn them. He smiled. The microscope was more complicated. He needed lenses. Glass was available in the Empire, rough, cloudy, but glass nonetheless. Constance found a glass blower in a town 2 days' journey away, a craftsman named Ulrich. Old, grumpy, with hands covered in burns from 30 years of working with molten glass. Dan went to see him with the blueprints. He showed them to him, explained. He needed a lens, convex on both sides, smooth, transparent, small. Ulrich looked at the drawings. He looked at Dan. He said he was crazy. Then he said he'd try. The first 10 lenses were no good, warped, cloudy, full of bubbles. The 11th was better, the 12th even better. The 15th was almost transparent and provided magnification. Dan looked through it at his fingertip and saw the lines of his skin clearly and in great detail. His heart began to beat faster. He ordered 3 more just like it. From the 4 lenses, he assembled a microscope. Garen made the brass tube. He came over especially for that. He brought his tools. He forged and polished it in 2 days. May found the mirror for the light source. It was small and silver. It had belonged to her grandmother. Dan assembled the contraption, the tube, 2 lenses spaced apart, the mirror at the bottom, the slide, and the flat glass from Ulrich. He focused it. He dripped a drop of water from the barrel onto the slide. He looked and saw them, tiny, transparent, moving, alive. Microorganisms. He watched for 30 seconds. Then he stepped back, sat down. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the fact that it worked. In this world, with these materials, with 4 lenses and a piece of brass. He saw what, before him, only Leeuwenhoek and Hook had seen 300 years ago in another world. He called for May. She looked. She recoiled. She looked again. She was silent. Then she said quietly that those were the ones, those tiny creatures he'd been telling her about. He said yes. She said she believed now, not because she hadn't believed before, but because it's one thing to hear about it and another to see it with your own eyes. Dan nodded. That's exactly what a microscope is for. Not for him, for those who don't believe, for those who need to see. Spring had come, and with it came the time to travel to Alerin. Constance had everything ready, an invitation from the Countess's widow, guarantees of safety within the Free City's territory, a venue for a public presentation, the main square. Constance called it a debate, a public discussion on the nature of the disease. She sent out invitations to the trading houses, the barons, the temples, and the order. Dan asked why the order. Constance said that if they weren't invited, they'd come on their own. Better to let them come officially, under the protection of the Free City's laws, where no one can be arrested or burned. Dan agreed. He'd been preparing for this for 2.5 years, ever since he crawled over to the dying boy on the dirt floor of the barn. Everything had led to this. Every wound he'd cleaned, every bar of soap, every page of the textbook, every child he'd saved. All of it had been preparation for this one moment, the moment when he would stand before the people and tell the truth and present the evidence. He packed the microscope into a wooden box lined with wool. He placed the box on the wagon. He sat down beside it. May sat on the other side. Ray rode ahead on horseback. Boris and Sal rode on either side. Constance rode in the carriage behind with Elliot and Sarah. Yona rode her mule. They left Quiet Hollow early in the morning. The village saw them off in silence. Garen stood by the blacksmith's shop and watched. Gorna stood by her house and crossed herself. Elsa waved. Anna was crying. Dan looked back once. He looked at the infirmary, at the log cabin that Garen had built from nothing, at the sign above the door, "My Hands." Then he turned away. The journey to Alerin took 5 days. Alerin was bustling and dirty and lively. Stone walls, narrow streets, markets, taverns, temples. People from all social classes, from the poor to merchants in fur coats. Free City lived by its laws and did not obey to the Baron nor the Order. Here you can be talk. Here you couldn't to burn. Constance took off at the house and square, small, cramped, but with a view of a place where tomorrow everything will be decided. Dan didn't sleep all before the debate. I didn't out of fear, because the 3 that he once at had scrolled in my head what he would say, how he'll show, what he'll do objections. May sat beside him. She saying anything? She just was there. In some point he turned toward her and said that he was afraid. She asked what? He said that wasn't not that they will be burned or be arrested, and that they believe it, that they'll look through microscope and what that it's a hoax, that a trick, that diabolical delusion, and everything will be in vain. May was silent. Then she said that she be in vain. that 7 villages already live according to its rules, what hundreds people are because that he washed his and boiled water.
What textbook exists? That Lian heals people in Cornwall, right? Right. What even if tomorrow the world says no to already no disappear? She said this just as she. That's, in short, exactly, without filler. He took her by hand. She didn't let go. It was sunny, the square filled by noon. People stood crowded together, merchants, artisans, peasants from the surrounding villages, nobles in fine cloaks, priests in gray robes, and a delegation of the order, 5 people in white robes with gold embroidery. At the head, supreme healer. The old man with long white beard and eyes accustomed to that their word is not disputed. Next to, with it, stood a man whose Dan didn't know, tall, thin, with the face of a scientist and not priest, dark eyes that stared at Dan with an expression that Dan could not read. Constance whispered too that this is the archivist Anselm, the keeper of all records of the order, the man who knows more than he says. Dan remembered the face. The debate began according to the rules of the city. At first, the prosecutor, the supreme healer, stepped onto the platform. He spoke for an hour, eloquently, confidently, about the divine nature of illness, about weakness of spirit, about punishment for sins, about how healing is a gift from the gods, accessible through prayer and blessing, about how a self-proclaimed healer without a blessing is a heretic and his methods are deception and witchcraft. The crowd listened. Some nodded. Some remained silent. Dan listened too, calmly, intently. He didn't interrupt. Then it was his turn. He stepped onto the platform. He placed a wooden box on the table. He opened it. He took out a microscope. The brass tube glinted in the sun. The square fell silent. Dan began to speak, softly, calmly, without fanfare. He said he had not come to argue about the gods, that he did not know whether the gods existed and would not presume to judge, that he had come to show what he had seen with his own eyes and what anyone could see. He took a mug. He scooped up some water from the city well, the very same one everyone in the square had been drinking from. He placed a drop on a glass slide. He placed it under the microscope. He focused the lens. He turned to the supreme healer and invited him to look first. The old man didn't move. The square waited. The silence was so profound that you could hear the pigeons shuffling their feet on the temple's cornice. The supreme healer approached, slowly, with dignity. He leaned toward the eyepiece. He looked for a long time. He recoiled. His face turned pale. He took a step back, then 2. The square erupted in a murmur. Dan raised his hand. The square fell silent. He spoke calmly and softly so that everyone could hear. He said that what the supreme healer had seen were living beings, that they exist in every drop of water, on every unwashed hand, in every dirty wound, that they kill people, children, the elderly, mothers, that they are neither a punishment nor a curse, that they simply exist, and that now we know how to stop them. By boiling, with soap, with cleanliness. That this is neither magic nor a miracle, that this is knowledge, and that knowledge belongs to everyone. He stepped back from the microscope. He said one word. Come forward. The merchant was the first to approach, a fat man with a red face. He looked. He straightened up. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He walked away in silence. The priest was the second to approach, a young man from Bishop Torvald's entourage. He looked. He crossed himself. The third to approach was a woman, a simple peasant woman in a dirty dress. She looked. She raised her head. She turned to the crowd. She said aloud what she had seen, that there were tiny creatures there, that they were moving, that the doctor was telling the truth. A line formed at the microscope.
Dan stood nearby and explained to each person what they were seeing, calmly, patiently, like a teacher, which is exactly what he was. The line stretched on until sunset. The sun was sinking behind the walls of Alaran, and shadows fell across the square in long streaks. People kept coming. They looked. They walked away with changed expressions. The Supreme Healer stood off to the side with his entourage, white, motionless. He understood that his world had just come to an end, quietly, without blood, without a miracle, just a glass tube and a drop of water. Archivist Anselm stood a little apart from the others. He wasn't looking through the microscope. He was looking at Dan. His face was calm, almost satisfied, as if he had been waiting for this. Dan caught his gaze. They looked at each other across the square full of people.
Anselm tilted his head slightly. Not a bow, an acknowledgement. Dan realized in that moment that Anselm knew about the notebook, about Brother Lucian, about everything, that this conversation was coming, that it would be difficult. But today, none of that mattered. Today, only one thing mattered. People were leaning toward the brass tube and, for the first time in history, seeing the truth with their own eyes. The sun set. The square began to empty. Torches were lit along the walls. Dan stood on the platform and looked out at the city, at the rooftops, at the sky, at the first stars. Behind him stood the 6 women who had come here with him. May, Leanne, who had come all the way from Cornwall just for this. Constance, Yona, Ray, Sarah. None of them were crying. All 6 were smiling, in different ways. May's smile was brief and firm. Leanne's was quiet and radiant. Constance with one corner of her mouth, as if allowing herself a moment of weakness. Yona with teary eyes but her back straight. Ray, broad and open as always. Sarah, barely noticeable, but warm. 6 women, 6 smiles. One thing. Dan stood and looked at the stars. He thought of his mother, of the Sunday phone call that would never come, about how maybe someday he'd find a way to send her a single word, a single page, that he was okay, that he'd found his place, that his knowledge hadn't been lost, that somewhere in a world she'd never see, children were waking up alive in the morning because their mothers had washed their hands. He didn't know if he'd succeed, but he knew something else. Today, in the square of the free city of Alaran, the old world came to an end. Not with thunder and lightning, not with blood and fire, with a drop of water on a pane of glass and a line of people that stretched until sunset. May walked over. She stood beside him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He covered her hand with his own. She said it was time to go, that there would be a lot of work tomorrow. He nodded. She was right. There would be a lot of work tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a year from now, and 10 years from now. But today, he allowed himself to stand there for one more minute, to look at the stars, and to think about how the world might change. Not because someone tells it to, but because someone will show the way. He stepped down from the platform. 6 women were waiting for him, and a long road home. He set off.